Museum in Melbourne. Um, Thought I'd just share this with everyone in real time, because I don't think I've done this before on my channel. I'm gonna mostly just walk around, go inside cabs of locomotives and all that. Not sure if I'll be doing a lot of commentary on this, because I have milked most of the exhibits here to death on this channel, to the point where some of you may already know what they are just by looking at them for a sec. But yeah. Enjoy this live stream where I just walk around and be doing a lot of commentary on this, because I have milked most of the exhibits here to death on this channel, to the point where some of you may already know what they are. So here we have the former Newport Workshops pilot number 236, built as 506 E506 by David Monroe in August 1890. Ran for about 60 years until 1954, when it was preserved by Victorian Railways, and came to this museum in 1961-62, where it's remained ever since. You can see one of its original builder's plates from the 1900s. The originals were given off to some kid in Williamstown during the 1900s, according to some VR newsletter at least. You can see the hand railings that were leftovers from when it was a workshop shunter. It would have been innocuous to the shunter's steps that would have been that would have covered like the wheels, so the shunters can actually climb onto them and ride the locomotive whilst holding onto these handrails on the tank. You can see that it's in pretty poor condition cosmetically because of all the rust that you can see on the footplate. And ironically enough, the engine was noted to be in decent condition when retired in the 1950s, and is probably the only E-Class in somewhat decent condition mechanically, or at least in the best condition. You can see the buffer housings, air reservoirs, the brake pump, also some metal stairs to get inside the cab. Hand sanitizer, might as well have some of that. Here's the interior of the cab. A lot of stuff here. Wooden floorboard, regulator, which appears to have been welded. Pretty sure that's a reversing wheel. Injectors. Steam gauges and brake gauges. The handle that you would have pulled to blow the whistle, which the whistle itself is currently absent. It got removed during the 50s. You can see the door to access the firebox to chuck all the coal in. You can see a little tap on the tank. A little seat for presumably the fireman to go on. Here's the back. And here we have the parking brake they would use to, of course, park the engine when you stop moving it. You can see some of the weather effects on the loco, especially through this hole piercing through the cab. It's also interesting to note that the engine's missing one of its glass windows. One glass window is missing from this porthole, while the glass is still intact here. And that gives me an opportunity to peek through here to show you the inside of the coal bunker. Here's where all the coal would have come out. You can see, I believe this is where you can apply the brakes. The air brakes on the locomotive. You can see the water glass gauges to check how much water's in the boiler. You can see the levers for the injectors are just jammed, they're just welded on. You can see some of the boiler cladding, the actual back head of the boiler. And there's a little marking here. I wonder what that says. Clearly, probably something. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's referring to the boiler pressure and the pressure of the cylinders. Might reflect its last overhaul it had in the 1940s. Oh, hello, Josh Tube. Hello. How you doing, man? So stepping out of the locomotive, we can see the back. Of course, it never had these specific plates in its working life, and the only times it would have had number plates was when it was numbered 506, E506 in the 1890s to about 1920. When it was renumbered to 236, it never wore any number plates. It only wore its builder's plate. So yeah, they're a bit historically inaccurate, but it's meant to match the green livery the engine's currently wearing, which is what it would have been out-shopped with in the 1890s. So I guess it's nice that they put those here. Here we have the internal valve gear. You can see the actual pistons, expansion links, all that stuff. You can see one of the water tubes, I believe. One of the pipes that would connect the two tanks here to distribute water evenly. I think, I don't know, someone can correct me, I'm not a huge rail engineer or whatever. Those pipes are also found connecting the bunker up. There's a third tank underneath the bunker, which just sits there, and there are pipes connecting from that tank to the main side tanks, which are visible. Hope I made that clear. You can see one of the leaf springs on the locomotive. And I think I'll shut up about 236 because I foamed over it multiple times on this channel. Let's move on to T94, which is a T-Class 060 mixed traffic goods locomotive. I think it's goods, I can't remember. Oh, look at that. A hole's actually pierced through the smoke box. Not good. You can even see some more damage here. Yeah, that's what the thing... Yeah, I'm at a railway museum. I'm at the Newport Railway Museum in Melbourne. The largest railway museum in the city that I'm in. So, T94, built in 1884 by the Phoenix Foundry of Ballarat, baked to a design based off of an engine that was purchased by VR from Bayer Peacock & Co. in England. And, this engine was one of the last T-classes to be owned and operated by Victorian Railways. It and another engine of this type were used as shunters at the Newport power station to supply coal to the power stations that would supply power to the substations of Melbourne's electrified suburban rail network. And they worked there until the early 50s. And pretty much this guy had the same outcome as 236 in the sense both were restored to their green liveries and displayed together in the 50s. And it also arrived in the museum during 1961-62. You can see holes are piercing through areas of the locomotive. This is just more of the weaker bits. Here's the cab of the T-Class. You obviously cannot go inside, unfortunately. That's sad that they never try to restore these magnificent machines. There have been times where they did get restorations in the past, but yeah, they take some time for them to be executed. Who knows? One day they will be professionally restored sympathetically, and they'll look great again. Interesting note is that the tender of the locomotive is actually not the original that it would have been built with, but rather a tender from a long-gone class of loco. This tender came from one of the Baldwin-built 460s VR had during the late 19th century. And people say it's either from a W or an S class. That's a W class. But either way, it is an American Baldwin-built tender. And what they did with these tenders was that Victorian Railways would scrap the engine units of these tenders would have been paired with. And, well, the tenders would be given second lives and be paired up with multiple other locos they had running. So that's pretty nice to see. Just give one good look at the Baldwin tender. The engine at some point was also modified with middle wheels that didn't have flanges in them, so it can negotiate tight curves at the power station it worked at. Good look at the valve gear. I want to see one of these bad boys on the rails again. Well, given the fact that most of these vehicles are pretty old, and they've been fighting the weather for a very long time as well, I doubt they'll be restored easily. I think many things would have to be done in order to get these things running. And I'm pretty sure it'll cost, like, a lot of money let's move on to something else now. This red 460 loco. This is D2604. It was built by Bayer Peacock in 1912 as one of 260 plus DD class locomotives, the design of which came out in 1902. And D2604 is the only surviving member of the original DE class to retain its original form, and this was one of the examples that got superheated. And during the 1920s, VR reclassified the DDs and split them into two subtypes. The original saturated DDs that didn't have superheaters were given the classification of D1, and the superheated ones became the D2s, and this is one of the D2s because it had the superheater. And some years later, VR would take 90 or so DDs, well, D1/D2s, and make them into a new type called the D3, which basically gave them larger boilers similar to those on the K-Class, consolidation, and they were pretty much the better performers, and they were favored by enginemen. However, D2604 was one of the lucky ones that didn't get the rebuild, and in 1956 was sold by Victorian Railways to a paper mill who used it until the early 60s, and it ended up at the museum thanks to them donating it. You can see some relics from its time at the paper mill, such as these hand railings and step ladders on the front, as well as this weird Frankenstein tender, which apparently was built using spare parts. The tender frame comes from, I believe, an A2 class 460, and the tender tank comes from a D3, which is one of the DZs that was converted with the larger boilers and all that. And the tender tank from the D3 is shorter than the A2 frame, which gives the extra space at the back for people to stand on. Bit of a weird alternative for shunter steps, but some of the D1s did have shunter steps added, because they were being relegated to secondary duties and all that. You can see the pump directly positioned next to the smoke box, and this interesting innovation of a dual coupling system where it had automatic couplers and chain couplers on the same structure. The chain couplings are obviously missing, they've been removed since, but the auto coupling is still there. And over here is steam crane number 19, built during the 1940s at Newport. This was one of the very last steam-powered machines to run in commercial service in the Melbourne area. I believe it ran until the 1980s, lasting well into the diesel era. I think, just picture that. And also cranes, steam cranes like this one had tenders, which were basically boxcars attached, presumably to store unnecessary equipment, and probably fuel for the actual boilers and all that on these cranes. Here we have K-Class locomotive 165. This is probably one of the more successful designs VR had. And there were some of the more longer-lasting ones. The last of these guys came out in 1922, I believe, and the last of them was withdrawn after being used as a pilot somewhere in the 1970s. Now, earlier I said the D3s, which were rebuilds of the D1/D2s, they had the same boilers as these locomotives, which looked like this. And that also helped standardize the two types, meaning that the Ks and D3s can now share the same boiler. Here's a very historic locomotive that I would really like, and it's pretty special to me. N432. It was built in 1951 and was the very last steam loco to be built at Newport workshops, and also the entire Melbourne area, and also Victoria. It didn't really last that long in service, being retired in 1966, I believe? Somewhere in the 60s, and is now one of two surviving N-classes in preservation, the others in South Australia. It's quite incredible VR actually produced steam locomotives this late, especially knowing that a couple of years later, the first mainline diesel B60 would hit the rails. Here's another 1950 steam loco, J556, disguised as class member 559. The J's were some of the very last steam locos to be introduced on the VR, coming out in the early 1950s. I believe it's 1954. Let me just check the build display up here. Pretty sure it is around that time. And they didn't have that much of a long service life as their predecessors. They only lasted from the 50s until 1972. The reason why 556 in particular is disguised as 559 is because of a failed preservation attempt. Not really an attempt, but some preservation unfortunate. So, basically in the 1970s, J559 was retained for potential display at this museum because in historical context, it was the very last steam locomotive to enter service with Victorian Railways, and Victorian Railways wanted to allocate it to the museum, so they had it in storage, but unfortunately a fire struck which damaged the locomotive, so it was scrapped ultimately, and 559's plates went on to its classmate 556, and 556 went to the museum in the end. Quite unfortunate that 559 didn't make it, but at least its classmate did. Here we have the sole surviving C-Class consolidation C10, introduced in, I believe, 1918, and there were some of the more powerful locomotives Australia had introduced. They lasted until the 1960s. C10 in particular was built in 1922 at Newport workshops. Here's a bit of a cousin to 236, who we just witnessed earlier, E369. So, during the 1890s, when 236 was built, VR ordered 5 060 shunting engines based on the E-Class design, and the result was the EE class. 5 of them were built by the Phoenix Foundry in Ballarat, and starting from 1898 to the early 1920s, multiples were converted. Multiple of the original E-Class 242s were rebuilt into 062s. 369 was one of them, being converted into an 062 EE in 1919. It features some of the stuff that used to be on 236 but isn't there anymore, such as the shunter steps I mentioned earlier, the black livery, the 5-chime steam whistle, which is pretty loud actually, especially for a shunting engine. But it also has features 236 didn't receive, obviously the 062 wheel arrangement, and also the inclusion of an automatic and chain coupling, basically a dual coupling system. I was entering the museum's station building, and there was a preview of a DVD playing on one of the television screens, and one of them featured moving footage of 369. Thought that was kind of cool. Here we have A2884, the sole surviving original A2 class with the Stephenson's type valve gear. This one was built in 1915 at Newport workshops. The design emerged in 1907, a few years after the fellow 460DD class. And A2884 was withdrawn from service in the 1960s and, rather strangely, was converted to use as a stationary boiler at Newport workshops. Well, not Newport workshops, but at North Melbourne. And would occasionally steam up at a few hours' notice for generating steam in the Melbourne area, and it kept serving this purpose until the end of the decade. In the 1970s, it was found at storage at Newport workshops, and then later it was snagged up and placed in the Newport Railway Museum, as we can see today. Over here to the largest thing in the museum now, Heavy Harry H220, built in 1941 at Newport. It was the largest locomotive to be built in-house by an Australian railway, and it was only one of a few 484 locomotives to be built with 3 cylinders. I can only recall 2 German locomotives having this sort of arrangement, and an experimental American one. This one uses the very obscure Henschel conjugated valve gear. H220 was intended to run overland expresses between Melbourne and between Ballarat and I believe Adelaide, but the line it would have planned to the line where H220 was planned to go on was found to be too weak for the weight of the engine because it weighed 260 tons. So basically it was reallocated to the Northeast Railway line due to World War II happening that prevented any plans to straighten the tracks. So HG20 spent most of its life hauling goods trains on the Northeast Main Line, but it did haul occasionally the Spirit of Progress train as well between Melbourne and Albury, filling in for an S-Class 462 Pacific. Someone said that I can enter the cab of the L-Class, which is right here, L1150, built in the 1950s by English Electric, and was the very first mainline electric locomotive in Victorian railways. L1150 would survive into V-line ownership and was retired in 1987, along with classmate L1162. And due to it being the class leader, it was retained for preservation and restored back into original livery. Unfortunately, I cannot get inside the cab at the moment. It's been locked up. Here's another A2, A2-995. This is the later design of the A2 with the Walschaerts valve gear. This A2 is pretty significant because it did some things. One of the more significant events of its life happened in the early 60s when it and A2-996 hauled the very last broad gauge Spirit of Progress train before it was handed over to New South Wales Government Railways for the standard gauge rail network. It was built a year later after 884 in 1916. Here we have a little shunting locomotive. This is V56. It was built in 1959 at Newport, and basically served as a small shunter at Jolimont. Well, I believe it started at Newport and then went to Jolimont. And then later on, after VR basically died off in the 1980s, it became property of the Metropolitan Transit, whose logo is right there. And it worked at Jolimont, hauling suburban trains into car washers to get them cleaned off. And V56 was later... Oh, what the hell? I shouldn't have done that. Hold on. How do I fix this? Okay, that's good. And V56 was retired in the 1980s. It should be mentioned that V56 was the only member of its class built. So, a bit of a unique loco. It's a bit of a similar story with Heavy Harry, who was the only member of its class built, even though two more of these H-class Northerns were built. Well, two more were planned to be built, but due to World War II, only their frames were done, and they were never expanded upon. Alright, let's move up here. Let's move up a bit, shall we? I have limited time. Well, why did I pretend I had a watch here? Well, basically, the museum right now, it'll close in about 13 minutes, and I want to make the most of it, so I'm going to skip some stuff here. So, yeah. Sorry if I skipped your favorite exhibit, everybody in this live chat, but, should have come at a better time, but oh well. You can see a Hitachi Suburban car, a Harris, an E-Class Butterbox electric locomotive, the former Spotswood's crane, Spotswood's reclamation depot crane, oil tank, and let's talk about this little locomotive. This is steam crane number 2. It was built in 1890 by Dubbs and Company of Glasgow, the same company that built Dubsy, the famous steam crane in Scotland. Built in 1890 by Dubbs, it was mainly used as a workshops crane at Newport, but it was also seen working at North Melbourne as well. It would also occasionally assist in mainline rail derailments as well. And it was finally withdrawn from commercial service in 1970 after about 80 years of work. And it's been preserved ever since at the museum. And the tender is actually from an extinct H-Class 440 from the 1870s. and it was last used on steam crane number 3 Polly, and it was just attached to crane number 2 once when number 3 crane was restored back into its original 1890s appearance as Z526 Polly. I'll touch more on that in a future future discussion. Here's a mighty Hudson for all you Hudson lovers out there. The wind's really getting to me now. Let me just get her out here. There it is. This is an R-Class 464 Hudson locomotive, 704. It was built in 1951 by the North British Locomotive Company. And what's interesting about this example was that before it got shipped to Australia, it was actually brought over to the Festival of Britain, and it was displayed at the Industrial Power section, where it apparently stole the show. And then afterwards it was shipped to Australia and worked until the late 1960s. It had its farewell run, where it was moved under its own power to the Newport area, and a few days later after that tour occurred, an E-Class locomotive shunted it to the museum site, where it's been there ever since. You can see the white rods. And what makes the R704 stand out from the other members of its class is that it had silver stainless steel boiler banding, which was a relic of its appearance at the Festival of Britain. You could even see a plaque commemorating its appearance at that festival. And these R-classes were some of the last express passenger locos introduced on Victorian railways. And they were intended for mainline passenger use, as I sort of implied, but they were cut short from these duties due to the B-class diesels arriving around the same time. Well, not really, but about a year, 12 months later. This is one of them, B83. And what's interesting is that the B-classes are now some of the oldest operating diesels in mainline Australia. There's a couple still in use by the Southern Short Hull Railroad. Passing crane number 2. So here's the other end of the B-class. Here we have the Hitachi Suburban railcar, motor car. Adjacent to that is a Grey Ghost Harris, which were extensive rebuilds by Commonwealth Engineering from these guys, the Blue Harris trains. The Grey Ghost rebuilds were unsuccessful due to them making the cars heavier and restricted to only St Kilda and Port Melbourne lines. And they didn't really last that long. I believe they lasted at least a decade in service in this form. Here's the Blue Harris again, which is what they used to rebuild into the Grey Ghosts. This is the only surviving original Blue Harris. Well, it's only one of 3 surviving original Harris trains, but this is the only one to remain in its as-suburban condition. The other 2 were converted into a works train in the 1980s. And what's interesting is that during the 1980s, some of these vehicles were converted into locomotive-hauled passenger cars called the V-Line H-sets. And these H-sets started working with V-Line from 1983 until February of 2024, when they were all withdrawn from service. And only 3 of the H-sets are still around. Here's an S-Class, so Redmond Barry. This one was a demonstration unit at South Dynon, denoted by the D over here. Here's the front of a Hitachi car, as well as the semaphore signal. W-Class locomotive. Oh, so the V-Line BCH cars were converted from motor Harrises, and I assume the others were converted from trailers, I assume? Here's Heavy Harry. I'll just walk through again. What do you think of this museum so far, you guys? What do you think of the Newport Railway Museum, just from your first impressions from watching this live stream? What do you guys think of it? Let me know in the chat. Why are those trains sleeping? I don't know, because they're trying to recover from their long service lives. No, I won't. Here's an interesting one. This one was recently cosmetically restored, which makes it look more beautiful. This is one of the D3s that I mentioned earlier. This is basically what they look like. Larger boilers than the original DDs and all that. And this example, D3-635, is the only surviving Victorian Railways Baldwin-built locomotive left in existence, and possibly the only surviving broad gauge 5 foot 3-inch locomotive built by Baldwin left. So a pretty rare survivor over here. You can see some parts of it have been damaged, like the glass paneling on the headlights. And some of its doors were missing for a time, but those have been reinstalled. Pretty sure these are brand new doors, I think. You can see some holes piercing through the tender tanks. Bro, it's midnight. How do you get the sun up right now? Because I live in a different country to where you are, I imagine. How about I finish this live stream off with this 060 locomotive? This is my favorite 060 of all time, and it's Y108. Built in 1889 for the Y-Class 060 goods engine design. And they were pretty successful. They were even Australia's most powerful 060s ever. And this example, Y108, was withdrawn in 1963 after 70 plus years of work, and it's been preserved at the Newport Railway Museum ever since. And it's also apparently the most traveled locomotive out of everything else here. It has the highest mileage, which I think is pretty impressive. Now, it's been fun, but unfortunately I'm going to end off the live stream here because the museum closes pretty soon. So, if you enjoyed, make sure to subscribe if you hadn't already. And yeah, just stay tuned for my other content. So, yeah, signing off now. Goodbye.